Hello, young ladies and young gentlemen. Welcome back to Introductory Computer Science. Now, if you recall, the first step is to learn about these three things: assignment statements, variable names, and values, and how these three different things are related to each other, and then practice with them. Step number 2 is to learn about and practice with if-else statements, while statements, for statements, and functions, as you have seen outlined step 1 and step 2 in previous lectures. I want to talk about values for a minute. Step number 1 is these three things: assignment statements, variable names, and values. I want to talk a little bit about values and then shift over to another talk. A value for beginner students is usually a number or a string of text. So for beginners, typically a value that you work with in practice is a number or a string. As you continue to learn, you'll see that a value can also be a thing that is more complicated, like an array that can contain 5 values inside, or something a little bit more complex that we will call an object. A value can be an object, and an object is something you'll learn about that's more complicated than a number or string. Also remember that a value you can move around. Values are ways for a computer program to move information around from one part of the program to another. You assign a value to this variable name or to that variable name. You begin executing a function. You give the function input, which is a value or 2 or 3 values. So you begin executing a function, you give it input to start with, which is a list of values: 1 value or 2 values or 3 values. After the function finishes executing, it gives you back output. That output is a value. So without values, you can't move information back and forth among different areas of the computer program. So think of a value as something that you can move around. Now I want to do a shift. I want to do a bit of a sidewise shift, and I want to talk about JavaScript and objects. An object is a very important type of value. So I'm going to talk today briefly about the JavaScript programming language and what objects are in the context of that programming language. So this talk is for intermediate students, and I think it can be accessible to a lot of beginner level students as well. Most programming languages have an object-oriented framework, a set of object-oriented features connected together in a careful way, typically with things that we call classes and objects. And these object-oriented features go on top of these beginner-level features that you are learning about now. You write code using these beginner-level features, and then that code you want to package and maintain in a careful way. You use object-oriented features to package up and organize and maintain code that you write using these beginner-level building blocks. The object-oriented features for JavaScript are enormously difficult. The object-oriented features for JavaScript are tremendously different. Different is what I meant to say. Tremendously different and a little bit difficult from the design choices of other programming languages. So the designer of JavaScript decided to make the object-oriented framework of JavaScript incredibly different from that of Ruby or Python or C++ or Java. Now, why he chose to do that, I don't know. I don't see it as being a benefit, but it is what it is, and JavaScript does have an enormous role in the economy because of web browsers. So remember, JavaScript has an object-oriented framework that is so very different from the design of other object-oriented languages. I don't think there's a good reason for it, but that's the way it is. So let me ask a question. In JavaScript, my question is, in JavaScript, what is an object? And to help answer that question, I'm going to ask a second question. So I want to ask two questions in the context of the JavaScript programming language. What is an object? To help understand that question, my second question is, what is a value in JavaScript? In the JavaScript programming language, a value is almost always an object. There are only a very few exceptions. Those exceptions are null, undefined, true, false, any number, and any string. If it's not one of those things, then the value is an object. So, except for the most simple cases, every value is an object, except for values that are incredibly simple. True, false, numbers, strings, and also the default values, null and undefined, which basically have the meaning of missing or not found. I also want to say, we spoke about functions in earlier lectures. In JavaScript, a function is a value. That's right. In the older computer programming languages, before 1995, you had functions, but they weren't really values that you can move around the way you can move around other values. But in the newer programming languages, like JavaScript and Python and Ruby and Perl, a function is a value, just like numbers and strings. That's something that computer programmers have gotten used to over the past 25 years, but it was something very new for computer programmers in 1995. So a function is a value that you can assign to a variable name. And also in JavaScript, I should note that in JavaScript, a function is an object. That's a little bit weird. With most computer programming languages, we think of objects as being this, and we think of functions as being that. We don't usually think of them as being the same thing. But by definition, in JavaScript, a function is technically defined as a type of object. A function is an object. Of course, not all objects are functions, obviously. But that means that a function is a hybrid sort of thing. A function has the behavior you expect from a function, but a function also has the characteristics that you expect from an object, because by definition a function is an object. That means a function behaves like a function, but a function also has what we call properties, because the first thing you learn about a JavaScript object is that a JavaScript object has properties. So, what are we talking about? Here's an object. Now, a JavaScript object is a complicated thing, but the first thing to learn is that an object in JavaScript is a hash. Different programming languages have different terminology. A hash, associative array, in Python it's called a dictionary. It's a string to value mapping, which is to say, an object in JavaScript is like an array, but instead of looking up values by 0, 1, 2, 3, you look up values by a string, and then you use that string to look up the value. So an object in JavaScript has many properties, and each property is a name and a value, a name and a value, a name and a value. You use the name to look up the value. Think of it as being like an array, but instead of using an integer to look up and find the value, you use a string to look up the value. Now, each name is a string. So JavaScript has many properties. Each property is a name and a value, a name and a value. Each name is a string. You use the name to get access to the value. So you have these sorts of data structures in every computer programming language, and every programming language calls it something different. A hash, a dictionary, associative array. It's a string to value mapping. So it has many different values, and the values are stored and indexed by a string value, which you use to look up the value. So in JavaScript, an object is, to start off with, a hash. It is a dictionary where you use string values to look up your value. You use strings to look up values. And you typically could create these. You bring these properties into existence by doing this. Object 1 dot, and here I give the property name, age equal 55. Or object 1 dot gender, that's my name, equal the string female. So 55 and female are your values, and these are your names. So each property is a pair, a name value pair. Now, in JavaScript, an object is a hash, but it has many other characteristics that make it more sophisticated than a hash. I cannot explain all of it, but one I do want to say is each JavaScript object inside it has a little pointer, and that pointer points to another JavaScript object. So every JavaScript object has an access pointer to a second JavaScript object, which is called its prototype. So this object is a prototype of the object that I was talking about, or the prototype object of the object I was talking about. Why does that matter? Well, that's a long discussion, but first, when I use computer code that uses this object, I can use the properties that it has access to. And it has access to these properties, but it also gets access to, it inherits. This object here inherits access to the properties of its prototype object. So you can use this object to get access to properties from the object itself, but also properties that are attached to its prototype object, and also properties that are attached to the prototype object of the prototype object. We'll discuss that later. And that is basically the beginning of understanding the inheritance, the prototypal inheritance mechanism in JavaScript that is very, very different from class-based inheritance in Ruby or in Python or Java. This uses inheritance for objects that is prototype-based inheritance. And it's based upon the fact that every object in JavaScript has a pointer that gives access to a second object called that object's prototype object. There I stop.